In the winter of 1899, a small Kansas town was swallowed by snow and something far darker. Over 300 families vanished, but when the thaw came, there were no bodies. Only smoke, silence, and a warehouse with a furnace that never stopped. Burning. What unfolded in Hayes wasn't just mass murder, it was a carefully engineered erasure. And the most terrifying part? The killers were the most trusted men in town. This is not just a horror story. It's a true story of how evil thrives when no one asks questions. In the frozen grip of 1899, Kansas surrendered to a season unlike any in memory, a winter so bitter it carved its way into legend. Hayes, a humble town nestled along the Kansas Pacific Railway, raced for another cold stretch. But what came wasn't just a weather event, it was a reckoning. As the prairie was swallowed by ice and the thermometer plummeted to a terrifying minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, Hayes seemed to vanish beneath snowdrifts. Yet the frost wasn't the only thing killing people that year. Something far colder was at work, something man-made, deliberate, and monstrous. When the thaw finally came months later, the town's tragedy surfaced, not in the form of bodies, because those were largely missing, but in numbers. The official records told one story. Over 300 families perished in the deep freeze. But when the earth softened and graves were expected to be full, only 47 were found buried. The rest, gone. No remains, no trace, no answers. It was the Parker brothers, Thomas and Samuel, who offered help during those dreadful months. Their warehouse on the town's edge had been a place of warmth, supplies, and what many thought was Christian kindness. But years later, authorities would uncover the truth. What burned in their massive furnace wasn't just wood or scrap. It was evidence. It was families. The tale begins not with bloodshed, but with hope. Hayes had been thriving, a frontier community of roughly 8,000 people. Life revolved around the railway. Main Street buzzed with businesses, and churches sang of perseverance. Families lived isolated but proud, dotting the prairie in sod homes and wooden cabins. Surviving with grit and ingenuity, the Parker brothers arrived in 1894. They weren't born in Hayes, but they settled in quickly. Thomas, the elder by 3 years, carried himself like a man who measured everything he saw. His gray-flecked hair and sharp blue eyes gave him an aura of wisdom, or at least calculation. Samuel was the charmer, shorter, broader, with hands hardened by labor and a constant grin that never reached his eyes. They purchased a warehouse and branded themselves as estate and crisis cleaners, handling the affairs of those who had passed. In a time when death was almost routine, and many families had no way to manage the aftermath, their service was essential. They collected bodies, cleaned out homes, sold belongings, and prepared properties for new settlers. They had a system, and the town praised them for it. Their warehouse became known for its reliability. They ran 2 large wagons, employed drifters as needed, and operated a towering furnace originally used to burn scrap and trash. They claimed it helped them safely dispose of unsellable or disease-contaminated items. It also masked a far darker purpose. In early November 1899, the snow came 3 weeks too soon. By mid-December, Kansas was a ghost state. Railways froze, supply routes became impassable, and the outside world might as well have been the moon. Hayes was stranded. But the Parkers? They were prepared. Their warehouse was bursting with coal, dried food, blankets. They had converted their furnace to burn multiple fuel types and even built a reinforced sled to cut through snowbanks. While others froze and starved, the brothers operated smoothly, almost eagerly. As townsfolk began to collapse under the pressure of survival, families turned to the Parkers for help. And help they did: offer food, warmth, supplies, even temporary lodging. But some who entered that warehouse were never seen again. Sarah Henderson, who ran the telegraph office, wrote in her diary on November 18th that she'd never seen frost form so violently. That day, the temperature had plunged 30 degrees overnight. By dawn, Hayes looked like a battlefield smothered in white. Within days, the train system shut down. Prairie families were marooned. Some, desperate, tried to reach town on foot. Many never made it. Mary Kellerman, the town's unofficial clerk, noticed something unsettling that winter. The Parker brothers began visiting her office often, asking pointed questions about inheritance rules and property transfers. They wanted to know how land was reassigned if no kin could be found. At the time, she thought they were preparing for a flood of work come spring. Later, she understood they were preparing for something else entirely. Throughout December, the brothers made frequent trips to far-flung homesteads, bringing provisions and checking in. Or so they claimed. In many cases, these visits coincided with the sudden disappearance of entire families. Take the Kowalskis, 12 miles north of Hayes. On December 14th, Thomas and Samuel visited them. 3 days later, neighbors found the homestead abandoned. When asked, the Parkers claimed they'd relocated the family to Missouri. No one ever located them or any relatives. Meanwhile, the Parker furnace roared night and day. A thick, dark smoke poured into the winter sky. Locals began to complain of a strange, almost syrupy odor that clung to clothes and stung the eyes. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the town physician, attempted to investigate, but the brothers always intercepted him with plausible reasons: infected bedding, contaminated goods, spoiled food. He left, uneasy but unconvinced. By the time the new century rolled in, the town's population had seemingly halved. Properties stood silent, frostbitten, and unclaimed. Yet, curiously, many of them were swiftly transferred to new ownership, often with the Parkers' fingerprints on the paperwork. Furniture from supposedly perished families turned up in the brothers' warehouse, tagged and priced. And then there was Janet Thornfield, a widow who'd run a boarding house in Hayes for over 20 years. Janet knew everyone. She began noticing irregularities, deaths without funerals, estates processed before announcements were made, and property transfers completed with unusual haste. So she started keeping notes, names, dates, conversations. The Parkers, she concluded, were reporting deaths at an impossible rate. In December and January alone, they claimed to have handled 43 family estates. Many of those families had recently been in good health, fully stocked for winter, and not at risk, at least not naturally. Her suspicions turned into horror on a bitter January night. While walking past the warehouse, she heard voices. Curious, she peered through a crack in the siding and saw a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, huddled near the furnace. Visibly distressed, Thomas Parker was speaking in low, urgent tones. The woman sobbed. One of the children whispered, "When? Can we go home?" Janet waited. The family never came out. Instead, she heard the furnace door open, close, open again, then heavy scraping. When she peeked again, only the Parkers remained methodical, focused, and alone. The next morning, she asked around. Based on their description, the family appeared to be the Hendricks, who, according to the Parkers, had frozen to death days earlier. From that moment on, Janet was certain something was terribly wrong. She began to watch the warehouse day and night, tracking every visitor, every wagon, every flicker of light from the furnace. What she uncovered wasn't just a story of greed. It was a method, a pattern, a perfectly designed system built not just for profit, but for erasure, and it was only beginning. By mid-January 1900, the town of Hayes no longer felt like a community. It felt like a graveyard with a heartbeat. The streets lay buried under unshoveled snow. Homes stood dark, and the wind carried more than a chill, it carried silence. There's Parker Brothers' warehouse was one of the few places that remained active. the only consistent sign of movement in a paralyzed town. Their furnace burned without pause, its black smoke curling into the frozen sky like a never-ending funeral pyre. Yet, to most in town, the brothers were heroes. People whispered about how Thomas and Samuel Parker had become the town's lifeline. They made dangerous trips to distant homesteads, brought in stranded families, and even managed to sell or reassign vacant properties before anyone else could. In a winter where hope had iced over, the Parkers kept things moving, or so it seemed. But for those who looked closer, a different pattern emerged. Janet Thornfield had become obsessed. Her boarding house was quiet now, most of her tenants either missing or relocated. With no one left to care for, she turned her full attention to the Parkers. Each day, she added notes to her ledger. Which families were said to have perished? What belongings turned up in the Parker warehouse? And how quickly ownership changed hands. She wasn't just suspicious anymore. She was documenting a crime. Her careful records told a haunting story. The deaths didn't follow patterns of starvation, frostbite, or disease. They followed visits from the Parker brothers. Families who were once thriving simply ceased to exist. No bodies. No funerals. No last words. By January 10th, Janet had a list of 17 families who had reportedly frozen to death. But she had spoken to many of them weeks before. They were healthy, prepared, and optimistic. It didn't make sense unless someone had ensured they wouldn't survive. And then there was the smell, that thick, cloying scent that wafted from the warehouse. Some likened it to burnt meat. Others said it had the sweetness of rotting fruit. No one could place it exactly, but everyone knew it didn't belong. Dr. Hartwell, now growing restless with the brothers' explanations, wrote in his medical journal, "This odor is not of anything I've encountered in any epidemic. It is unnatural. It is human." Despite his instincts, the doctor had no proof. The roads to the state capitol were still closed. Snowdrifts rose like barricades around the courthouse. No outside help could come, and the Parkers had effectively insulated themselves from oversight. But nature, in its cruel irony, offered a clue. On February 14th, a young girl named Emma Schultz wandered near the Parker warehouse. Buried partially in the snow, she found a toy horse hand carved, worn smooth by tiny fingers, and marked with the initials PB. It belonged to Peter Brennan, the 6-year-old boy from a family that had supposedly died 2 months prior. Emma showed the toy to her mother, who froze. She'd seen Peter playing with that very horse only days before his family's reported death. He adored it, never let it out of his sight. There was no way he'd have left it behind. Mrs. Schultz didn't waste time. She brought the toy to Janet Thornfield. The toy changed everything. Janet's suspicions became conviction. She began gathering others quietly, cautiously. People who had also noticed the town's unraveling, but hadn't dared speak up. She approached Dr. Hartwell, who had long doubted the brothers' stories. She visited Mary Kellerman, the record keeper, who still had copies of all the inquiries the Parkers made about land laws and death registrations. Together, they formed an informal task force, a secret alliance of neighbors who no longer trusted what they were seeing or what they were being told. The group met at night in Janet's parlor. Candlelight flickered across maps, handwritten logs, and crumpled property records. They compared names. They traced disappearances. They calculated timelines. What emerged was a web, a chilling map of precision, profit, and murder. The Parker brothers, it turned out, weren't just reacting to tragedy. They were orchestrating it. Their strategy was simple and devastatingly effective. First, they identified families who lived far from town, those with few connections, valuable land, and minimal chance of being missed. Then they offered assistance. A sack of coal here, a ride to town, a warm blanket, All of it built trust. Then they created dependence. They'd provide faulty heating fuel that burned too fast, forcing families to return for more. They'd spread quiet rumors about disease, isolating the victims even further. And once the family had nowhere left to turn, the brothers would offer an invitation. Come to the warehouse. We'll help you. No one came back. Mary Kellerman, who had access to death certificates and property files, noticed another pattern. Every time a family disappeared, their estate was processed within days. Normally, this would take weeks. But somehow, the Parkers had pre-approved documents, signatures that looked suspiciously identical, and land deeds that changed hands without legal review. Forgery, Mary whispered one night, her voice tight with fear. They're not just killing these people. They're erasing them. And the furnace, always the furnace. Its endless hunger now had a suspected purpose. Hartwell believed the brothers had modified it to reach extreme temperatures, capable of reducing bone to dust and cloth to ash. Number. Body. No evidence. Just smoke and soot. By mid-February, their suspicion had become certainty. But what could they do? The town had no functioning sheriff. The local judge was snowed in 20 miles east, and the only lawman left, Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, had been relying on the Parkers for updates on town affairs. Still, Janet was not one to wait. When the group learned, the brothers planned a visit to the Kowalski homestead, one of the last isolated families remaining. They decided to act. On the evening of February 22nd, under the cover of wind and darkness, Dr. Hartwell and Janet set out in pursuit. Using a borrowed sled, they followed the Parkers at a distance, navigating through deep snowbanks and barren fields. They reached the homestead just before dusk. The Parkers entered, greeted warmly by the family. The Kowalskis were clearly glad for the company, grateful even. The visitors brought food, blankets, and cheerful stories. Hours passed. The doctor and Janet waited, shivering in the cold. Hidden among a grove of leafless trees. Around midnight, the Parkers emerged with the entire family in tow. They carried bundles and walked slowly, as if preparing to leave. No sign of distress, just trust. The convoy turned toward town. But instead of heading for any home or church or hospital, the sled veered toward the warehouse. Janet and Hartwell followed. They watched as the family entered the building. The doors shut, the lights dimmed, and then the furnace came alive. Flames roared higher than ever. Smoke bled into the night sky. No voices followed. No one came back out. At dawn, frost still clinging to their coats, Janet and the doctor returned to town, their breaths visible, their hearts heavy. They had seen enough. The time for watching was over. It was time to confront the monsters hiding in plain sight. Morning arrived over haze, like a pale bruise, muted, aching, and slow to move. The town, still reeling from months of grief and starvation, remained unaware that something far more insidious had settled among them. But for Dr. Hartwell and Janet Thornfield, the shadows had faces now. The previous night's events, the Parker brothers escorting the Kowalski family into their warehouse, never to be seen again, left no doubt. The smoke that rose from the chimney wasn't just the stench of firewood. It was a funeral pyre. Without a prayer. By mid-morning on February 23rd, the hidden circle of citizen investigators had gathered at Janet's boarding house. Their voices were hushed but firm. They were past theory and conjecture now. What they had witnessed demanded action. The question was no longer if the Parker brothers were guilty. It was how to stop them before anyone else vanished. We confront them today, Janet said, her voice like iron wrapped in frost. Dr. Hartwell nodded. With evidence, with witnesses. They won't be able to explain this away. The group knew they couldn't storm the warehouse unarmed, not physically nor legally. They needed some semblance of authority. So they turned to Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan. Though overwhelmed and often ineffective, he was still the only thread of law left in Hayes. Initially skeptical, Brennan listened to their testimonies in silence. As the group laid out the pattern families disappearing, property transfers expedited, falsified documents, and now the Kowalski vanishing, his eyes darkened. Then Dr. Hartwell described the bloodstains on Thomas Parker's sleeves from the night before. Not animal blood, human. Brennan paled. "I'll come," he said. "But if this turns into something it shouldn't, I'll shut it down myself." That afternoon, a small delegation approached the Parker brothers' warehouse. The sky above was steel gray, and the snow, now trampled and sooty, gave off the pungent scent of smoke and decay. Janet led the group with quiet resolve. Dr. Hartwell walked beside her. Deputy Brennan followed, one hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Thomas Parker met them at the door with his usual calm demeanor, but a flicker of calculation passed through his icy blue eyes. "Well, this is a surprise," he said, glancing from one face to the next. "We have questions," Janet said, her voice steady. "About the Kowalski family." Thomas gave a rehearsed sigh. "They were suffering from exposure and frostbite. We transported them to relatives in Junction City. A difficult but necessary trip." "And the belongings we saw yesterday?" Dr. Hartwell asked. "The children's toys, the family's coats. Still in your warehouse?" "Items they couldn't carry," Thomas said. "We planned to send them later." Deputy Brennan stepped forward. "We'd like to search the premises now." Thomas's smile faltered. "I'm afraid that's not possible. We store materials contaminated by disease, a health risk." Dr. Hartwell interjected. "Then I'll go in alone, with proper precautions." "As a physician?" "No," Thomas said, voice sharp now. "Absolutely not." That was enough. Deputy Brennan narrowed his eyes. "Then we'll return with a warrant. And if you refuse again, we'll bring state authorities the moment the roads open." Thomas's face twitched. His composure cracked just slightly, like glass under stress, but he said nothing. Instead, he closed the door gently but firmly. They had made their move and been denied, but denial was confirmation in itself. That evening, the group reconvened. Their plan was simple: return with force. Deputy Brennan, Dr. Hartwell, and 3 trusted townsmen would break into the warehouse at dawn on February 25th. If they found nothing, they would be fools. But if the rumors were true, they would uncover one of the most horrifying operations in American frontier history. And so, just before sunrise, the small group returned. The air was bitter and dry. Their breath plumed out in front of them like ghostly warnings. They didn't knock. They broke the door in. What they found inside would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The front of the warehouse looked ordinary enough: boxes stacked, tools hung neatly, wood smoke in the air. But deeper inside, they uncovered an organized labyrinth of horror. Each room was designated for a different stage of the brothers' operation. There was a sorting chamber, filled with furniture, clothes, jewelry, even children's toys, each item carefully tagged with names, dates, and estimated resale value. This wasn't clutter. It was inventory. Another room contained records, binders, ledgers, maps. The brothers had documented every victim, location, possessions, how the property could be transferred, and even notes on community relationships. Some entries were coded, others chillingly candid. One read, "Hendricks, isolated, well-stocked, no surviving kin, high-value livestock." Then they reached the furnace. The smell hit them first, a rank mix of burning flesh, old fabric, and scorched metal. The furnace was monstrous, refitted with additional insulation and special grates. Around it lay scorched debris, melted metal scraps, and most damningly, Small bone fragments, many far too small to belong to adults. Dr. Hartwell, his hands trembling, picked up a scorched jawbone no larger than a child's. He turned to Deputy. "Brennan, there are bodies in here, or what's left of." They hadn't just imagined the horror. It had been real, all along. Hidden in plain sight. Masked by soot and smoke and smiling faces. In a locked back room, they found a crate. Marked Kowalski. Inside were dresses, boots, family photographs, a child's doll with singed hair. But no people. No survivors. The final piece of the puzzle came in the form of a journal, scrawled in Samuel Parker's hand. Inside were entries detailing their process, not just the logistics, but the psychology, the justifications, the rationalizations. "Better we end them now," one line read, "than let them starve in the snow. We cleanse the frontier. We do God's work in fire." Thomas's entries were colder, more transactional. He detailed property values, livestock, worth, how to fake travel documents, and how long it took to burn a body fully. They hadn't snapped. They hadn't panicked. They had planned. The evidence was overwhelming. By noon, Thomas and Samuel Parker were arrested. No resistance. No confession yet. Just blank stares. Men caught not in the act of violence, but in the silence that followed it. Word spread through haze like wildfire. Families wept. Others fled. The trust that had once held the town together now lay buried under the same snow that hidden. So many crimes. As the Parker brothers sat in makeshift cells at the courthouse, the people of Hayes began to reckon with the truth. The monsters they had feared all winter had been among them all along, smiling, serving, and killing. News of the Parker brothers' arrest spread faster than wildfire through Hayes, though the fires they'd kindled had burned much longer and much deeper. Within hours, the streets that had lain eerily silent all winter began to buzz, not with joy or relief, but with disbelief, grief, and a rising tide of horror. People gathered in hushed circles outside homes, the church, the courthouse. They whispered names, those who had vanished, those they thought had moved away, those whose deaths now sounded suspicious. For the first time, townsfolk began to count not only the missing, but the lies they had accepted. Inside the old county jail, the Parker brothers sat in separate cells, unspeaking, unmoved. Thomas stared at the wall with the same calculating detachment he'd always worn in public. Samuel fidgeted, muttering to himself at intervals, tracing shapes into the wooden bench with his finger. Neither confessed. Neither protested. But they didn't need to, because the real confession came from the objects they left behind, specifically a thick, leather-bound ledger found in a false drawer behind the furnace. It was blackened at the edges, warped by heat, and stained with what appeared to be blood. But its pages, remarkably, had survived. When Mary Kellerman and Dr. Hartwell opened the book, they didn't know they were holding the key to one of the largest mass murder conspiracies in American history. The ledger was handwritten in Thomas Parker's meticulous scrawl. Each line read like a transaction, but instead of inventory or customer accounts, it chronicled death, names, dates, property, values. Columns labeled assets, disposition, final status. And then, chillingly, method. The codes were simple. S for suffocation, BFT for blunt force trauma, P for poison, AR for arsenic via rations. By the third page, Mary had to leave the room. Dr. Hartwell stayed. There were more than 300 names in the ledger. Not just adults, but children. Whole families. Their lives reduced to entries in a profit and loss book. The ledger also revealed another horror. The killings had not started with the blizzards of 1899. The brothers had been perfecting their methods since at least 1897. In fact, The first 10 families in the book had been eliminated during what locals remembered as a relatively mild winter. It had never been about mercy. It had always been about opportunity. Back in 1897, the Parkers had begun by targeting the most isolated settlers' families, too far to call for help, with no relatives in town. Their deaths were written off as natural tragedies: starvation, cold, wolves, and each time the brothers offered their services free of charge. From there, their operation expanded. They learned which county officials could be manipulated, which death records could be filed without a physician's verification, and which property laws had loopholes. The ledger listed each scheme with chilling precision. One entry read, March 3rd, 1898, Wendell family. Father succumbed to fever. Widow poisoned 2 days later. Children removed. Land transferred via false kin notice. Inventory liquidated in 8 days. By 1899, they no longer waited for sickness or hardship. They created it. The ledger contained maps hand-drawn, carefully measured. Dozens of properties were marked with X's, some with notes like Stage 1 complete or ready for transfer. It was a hit list, a roadmap of murder and theft disguised as estate handling. Even more disturbing were the psychological notes Thomas kept in the margins. Lines like, they never ask for proof. Grief dulls curiosity. Easier to erase a life than explain it. They want to believe the storm took them. We only help it along. Mary, shaken but determined, spent the next 2 days copying the entries into official court records. The townspeople deserved to know the names of those they had lost and how they had been betrayed. One family, the Brennans, not related to Deputy Marshal Brennan, had appeared healthy and happy in town. Just days before their supposed demise, Mrs. Brennan had even bought fabric for curtains. Yet, according to the ledger, they were targeted for their livestock and the mineral-rich land beneath their home. December 25th, Brennan family. Worth, $720, land plus cattle. Final status, processed. Furnace 14 hours. That phrase, final status, processed, would go on to haunt the entire region. It wasn't just a euphemism for death. It was a corporate term, dehumanizing, cold. The Parkers didn't see their victims as people. They were assets, inventory, waste to be recycled. When news of the ledger reached neighboring counties, the state authorities finally pushed through the frozen roads. Investigators, court officials, even early reporters arrived in Hayes in horse-drawn sleighs, each bearing disbelief and horror. Soon, the warehouse was sealed off, declared a crime scene. The furnace was extinguished for the first time in months, but not before. Dr. Hartwell made one final discovery. Beneath the ash, embedded in the iron grate of the furnace, he found fragments of a human jawbone and several child-sized teeth. Had survived the inferno by lodging in a crevice, untouched by the hottest flames. There would be no doubt now, not among the people of Hayes, not in court, not in history. What the Parkers had done was not an isolated spree. It was a calculated system of extermination, a cold business cloaked in the language of charity. And Hayes had let them. The shock that rippled through the town wasn't just about the deaths. It was about complicity. How had no one noticed? How had they let the furnace burn, day and night, without question? How had they accepted the Parkers' accounts without asking for bodies, funerals, or farewells? Some wept. Others raged. Many simply stared at the snow, wondering how long the town had been dead already, and just didn't know it. By the end of that week, the courthouse steps were lined with candles. Names were read aloud from Mary's list. Families placed belongings. Photos, heirlooms where graves should have been. But there were no graves. Only ashes, and a ledger that proved, without any doubt, that the winter hadn't taken their loved ones. The Parkers had. As March crept into Kansas, the snow began to retreat, but the horror and haze was only beginning to thaw. Investigators, clergy, and journalists poured into town, their wagons and sleighs creaking over melting drifts, drawn by rumors that sounded more like Gothic fiction than truth. But inside the Parker Brothers warehouse, the evidence spoke louder than any tale ever could. The official count now stood at over 300 missing individuals. And while most bodies had been reduced to ash, the documents, testimonies, and the chillingly meticulous ledger gave voice to the voiceless. Still, questions hung in the air like smoke. Why? Why would two men respected, well-off, seemingly God-fearing commit atrocities that bordered on genocide? The answer came, not in court, but in the pages of a second journal, found tucked inside a rusted trunk in Samuel Parker's room, where Thomas's ledger was clinical and calculated. Samuel's diary was raw and personal, a twisted confessional that offered an unnerving glimpse into the mind of a killer who believed himself a savior. "We do not kill for pleasure. We kill for peace," one entry began. "Winter is a cruel mistress. The land shows no mercy. Why should we pretend otherwise?" Samuel described how, in their early days, the brothers genuinely believed they were easing suffering. Their first victims were already dying too weak to survive the freeze, too proud to beg for help. "We ended what nature began. Not murder, mercy." But that illusion didn't last. The diary's tone changed gradually, each entry darker, more confident, less apologetic. By the second winter, Samuel wrote about selecting families based not on need, but on the cleanliness of their records, the ease of erasure. No surviving kin, no children enrolled in town school, no church attendance, easier to remove. By the time 1899 arrived, their selection criteria were precise, mathematical. Livestock over 30 head, land above mineral line, tools in good condition, homes salvageable, eliminate. He even wrote about their furnace like it was a sacred thing, calling it the cleanser. Fire is pure. It leaves no bone to bury, no corpse to mourn. It frees them from hunger, from disease, from shame. We give them release. There was no remorse, only conviction. Samuel's writings stunned the investigators, but to the townspeople, they were validation. The mask had finally slipped. The sweet-talking younger brother, the man with the smile that never reached his eyes, was not just an accomplice. He was a believer. Meanwhile, Thomas remained unshaken. During questioning, he answered with cold logic. When asked, "Did you kill these people?" he responded, "We ended variables. We optimized the survival of the town." And in a way, the Parkers had survived better than anyone. While families froze in silence, the brothers thrived. They ate better, slept warm, collected goods, reallocated land. Each death was an acquisition, each victim a transaction, but they hadn't done it alone. Testimonies began to emerge from townspeople who had worked for the Parkers. Young men paid in food and shelter to process estates and deliver supplies. Most hadn't known the full scope of what they were part of, but some had suspicions. A drifter named Frank Collar stepped forward first. He'd been hired to move furniture and haul unsellable items to the furnace. But he remembered seeing things that didn't make sense. A blood-stained crib, a bundle of women's clothing still warm, and a family Bible charred around the edges but untouched inside. "I asked once," Frank recalled in his testimony, "why there were no funerals, why no one came looking." Thomas said, "The wind is their witness, and the fire their rest." Another worker, Henry Kellerman, Mary Kellerman's younger brother, remembered being sent to burn documents and photos. "I saw myself in some of those pictures," he said. "I was at the town picnic with those people. I was burning the only proof they ever lived." The town's moral foundation began to fracture. People wondered, were we blind or complicit? The sermons at First Methodist turned somber. Reverend William Hartwell, brother of Dr. Hartwell, addressed the congregation with tearful honesty. We trusted men who wore clean clothes and offered. Warm hands, he said, but so did their victims. He spoke of the need for accountability, not just in law, but in soul. The church began hosting grief circles, memory nights. People gathered to share stories of those lost not as names in a ledger, but as fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. They weren't just erased. They were mourned. The town, however, faced another challenge, the tangle of fraud left in the wake of the Parker crimes. Land ownership was a legal disaster. Dozens of deeds had been forged, families wiped from the books, properties resold in bad faith. Even homes that hadn't been touched directly bore the taint of suspicion. It would take years, and in some cases, decades for rightful ownership to be restored. Mary Kellerman led the effort. With her keen mind for records and her deep emotional investment, she began the arduous task of cross-referencing town archives with survivors' testimonies. She published public notices, called for claimants, and worked closely with state officials to reconstruct what the brothers had tried to destroy. If the courts must speak for the dead, she told a reporter, then I will make sure they are heard. And they were. Bit by painstaking bit, the names in Thomas's ledger were matched with their stolen legacies. Land was returned, stolen heirlooms redistributed, and family lines redocumented. But some names remained unclaimed. Some children had no surviving relatives. Some homes would remain empty forever. Still, the town refused to forget. A group of survivors erected a simple monument outside the old warehouse. It was a blackened iron plaque, mounted on stone. To those lost in winter's shadow, you were not forgotten. You will not be again. The warehouse itself now, cordoned off and marked as evidence, was a wound Hayes wore with pride and pain. The townsfolk refused to tear it down. They wanted future generations to see it, to feel what silence had cost them. As the Parker brothers awaited trial, public interest surged. Newspapers dubbed it the Furnace Murders. Stories spun wild, painting the brothers as frontier vampires or cultists. But the truth, as always, was far worse. They weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were neighbors, helpers, smiling faces at town gatherings, trusted voices, and they had built their empire on trust. That was the true horror of Hayes, not just the ashes in the furnace, but the realization that those who had killed so many had done it without masks. They'd done it in plain sight, and no one had stopped them, not until the ledger, not until the doll in the snow, not until it was far too late. By early spring, the roads leading in and out of Hayes had cleared, and with them came a wave of lawmen, lawyers, reporters, and strangers looking to witness the spectacle. Word of the Parker brothers' crimes had spread beyond Kansas beyond, the frontier even. It reached St. Louis, Chicago, and as far east as New York, where newspaper headlines screamed in horror. Furnace of death. Kansas brothers accused in mass murder plot. Hayes, once a quiet, hard-working prairie town, had become the reluctant epicenter of the worst mass killing in American memory. The townsfolk, still reeling, now found their streets crowded with outsiders, their names printed in newspapers, and their grief dissected in column inches. But what they wanted, more than sympathy, more than headlines, was justice. The trial of Thomas and Samuel Parker began on April 15th, 1900, inside a makeshift courtroom hastily constructed in the old town Grange Hall. The courthouse had proven too small and too symbolic to hold the weight of what had happened. The judge presiding was a federal appointee from Topeka, brought in to avoid any conflict of interest. The air inside the courtroom was tense, filled with citizens, families of victims, and curious strangers. The brothers entered in shackles, dressed neatly as always. Thomas wore a gray wool coat and carried the same unreadable expression he'd worn since the day he was arrested. Samuel, on the other hand, looked gaunt, twitchy, and utterly detached, his mind seemingly stuck somewhere between guilt and justification. The prosecution began by laying out the facts, beginning with the documents found in the warehouse. The property deeds, the inventory lists, and most damning of all, the ledger. The court heard testimony from Mary Kellerman, who presented over 200 pages of copied entries, each one documenting a person who had disappeared during the brutal winters. Each line landed like a hammer. Family, Kowalski. Final status, processed. Inventory, livestock, tools, bedding, no kin. Disposition, full. Jurors winced. Audience members wept. Some left the room entirely. Then came Dr. Hartwell, who took the stand with the stoicism of a man still in mourning. He described the blood on Thomas's coat, the odor in the warehouse, the discovery of bone fragments and children's teeth near the furnace grate. I've examined the aftermath of disease, famine, even childbirth in the wilderness, he said, but I have never encountered evil in so physical a form. He was followed by Frank Koller and Henry Kellerman, two of the part-time laborers who'd unknowingly helped the brothers clean homes, burn clothing, and transport materials to the furnace. Their testimonies painted a picture of eerie efficiency boxes packed before deaths were announced, clothing sorted before obituaries could be written. And then came the moment everyone dreaded, the reading of Samuel Parker's diary. It was prosecutor James Riley who read aloud from the pages, his voice wavering as he recited Samuel's words. We end them before the winter does. They die in warmth, in silence. Better than the slow rot of frost. God purifies with flood, with fire. We are merely his agents. Even those who believed in Samuel's madness had to confront the clarity of his pen. The defense, meanwhile, was weak at best. The public defender assigned to the brothers argued that the conditions of the winter had distorted judgment, that starvation, isolation, and psychological trauma could lead men to justify the unthinkable. He presented Samuel as a mentally disturbed man, manipulated by his older brother, but Thomas refused the pity. When asked to speak, he stood and looked the jury square in the eye. We did what we had to do, he said. They were going to die. Anyway, we ensured their deaths had purpose. Property was salvaged. Land was used. No one starved who didn't need to. There was no apology. No remorse. Only logic. It was chilling. The trial lasted just 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than a day. On May 7, 1900, both Thomas and Samuel Parker were found guilty on multiple counts of murder, fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful cremation of human remains. They were sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out that fall. The sentence was met with relief, but not celebration, because the truth was, no punishment could match the scale of what had been done. As the brothers awaited execution at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, investigators continued their work in Hays. The state opened a special commission to handle property disputes and fraudulent transfers. Officials began digging through burned archives, collecting oral testimonies, and cross-referencing every name in the ledger with surviving families. And still, new revelations surfaced. In March 1901, almost a year after the brothers' arrest, a construction crew renovating the old Methodist church basement stumbled upon a hidden compartment beneath the altar floorboards. Inside were more than just heirlooms. There were dozens of objects belonging to families the Parkers had claimed to process. Jewelry, family portraits, Bibles, even children's toys. But the most important discovery was a second ledger. This one, dated back to 1896. Written in a ciphered shorthand. It took months to decode. But when it was finally translated, its contents shattered what little innocence remained in the town. The killings had begun even earlier than anyone knew. At the center of the second ledger was something far more disturbing than the accounting of victims. It contained experimental notes entries describing various methods of killing, doses of poison, burn temperatures, the time it took for bones to turn to ash. Poison in flour blends faster. Effects delayed, but clean. Better for children. No teeth remain after 10 hours at 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit unless wedged between grates. The Parkers weren't just murderers. They were methodical, scientific, practiced. They had used the town as their testing ground and winter as their excuse. This discovery reopened wounds that had barely begun to close. Families who had once believed, themselves untouched by the tragedy, now questioned everything. Some started checking old possessions for markings. Others revisited conversations they'd had years ago. With the Parkers' small comments that now seemed sinister in hindsight, it became clear. No one in Hayes had truly been safe. By summer's end, the brothers' execution loomed. Public opinion demanded it. The press arrived once again to cover the event. Outside the penitentiary, crowds gathered, holding signs, photos, and candlelit vigils, not for the condemned, but for the dead. On the night before their hanging, Samuel finally broke. In a rambling confession to the prison chaplain, he admitted that his conscience had been tearing at him since the first time he'd helped his brother process a living person. The girl, she asked me why the fire smelled funny. She was crying, he said, and I told her it was just winter's smell. He wept, curled in his cell like a child. But Thomas, when informed of his brother's breakdown, reportedly laughed. He always was the weak one. On October 15th, 1900, the Parker brothers were hanged. Samuel died trembling and pale. Thomas met the noose with steady eyes. The townspeople didn't cheer. They stood in silence as the rope snapped taut. Not because they pitied the men, but because justice, when delayed and buried under months of snow and ash, doesn't arrive with triumph, it arrives with grief. In the wake of the Parker brothers' execution, Hayes did not rejoice. There were no bells ringing, no parades, no sighs of relief. Instead, the town felt heavier, as though the weight of all that had happened had finally settled, pressing down on every rooftop and every soul. The execution had ended 2 lives, but it hadn't brought back the hundreds lost. It hadn't filled the empty homes or erased the scorch marks from the warehouse walls. The truth was, Hayes wasn't just grieving, it was lost, many of the surviving. Residents found themselves wandering through town in quiet reflection. They walked past abandoned farms and stared at doorways that would never again welcome laughter. The buildings remained, but the people were gone, erased not only by death, but by the systematic attempt to remove their very existence from memory. Some townspeople couldn't bear it. Within weeks of the execution, over a dozen families packed their things and left Hayes for good. They said they needed a fresh start, somewhere untouched by the horrors that had unfolded in their midst. Others, too old or too tied to the land to leave, stayed behind and did what they could to rebuild. One of them was Janet Thornfield. Janet, once the quiet boarding house owner who had noticed strange patterns, was now regarded as the town's reluctant sentinel, respected, admired, and forever changed. She kept detailed journals of everything that happened, as if the very act of recording could somehow protect the future from forgetting the past. Her once modest guest register now held records of loss, witness statements, land titles, and maps of families that no longer existed. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, too, remained in Hayes, though the man who had once exuded confidence and calm now moved with the weariness of someone who had seen too much. He resumed his medical practice, but patients noticed how his hands trembled slightly when he wrote prescriptions. and how his eyes would drift toward the window, as if watching something that wasn't there. His medical journals, once clinical, now included personal reflections. One entry read, "It wasn't just death. It was erasure, the deliberate undoing of memory. A kind of murder that kills the past, not just the body." The town's church, too, became a sanctuary for the grieving, not just the faithful. Reverend William Hartwell delivered sermons about darkness, not metaphorical, but real. About evil that doesn't wear horns or carry knives, but walks beside you, helps you, smiles at you while it prepares your grave. The devil does not always come roaring, he preached. Sometimes he comes as your neighbor, your friend, your helper in the storm. The community began holding monthly gatherings in the church basement. They weren't quite religious services, more like group therapy. Survivors shared stories of the families they'd lost, the meals they'd shared, the birthdays never celebrated. Again, they lit candles for names carved into a new memorial that had been erected in the center of town. A tall iron obelisk engraved with a simple line, "We remember." But even remembering became difficult, because there were still so many unanswered questions. In June 1901, a new investigation began, not led by lawmen, but by historians and early criminologists, drawn to the mystery of how such evil could take root in an ordinary town. They came with notebooks and magnifying glasses, examining records, interviewing aging witnesses, and combing through the burned remains of the warehouse. It was during one such investigation that they found a hidden basement room previously unnoticed because it had been sealed with floorboards beneath crates of ash. Inside, they discovered what could only be described as a trophy vault. There were boxes labeled with family names, each containing personal artifacts, wedding rings, love letters, baptismal certificates, children's drawings. The items had been carefully preserved, as if the Parkers couldn't fully let go of their victims. Why had they kept them? As tokens? As reminders of their power? Or had they simply wanted proof for themselves that these people had once lived before they made them disappear? It was a chilling contradiction. The same men who had burned families to ash had also archived their memories. A private museum of lives they'd ended. Worse still, there were maps, folded and yellowed with age. They detailed vast stretches of prairie surrounding haze, each marked with X's, coordinates, and strange symbols. A team of volunteers and investigators spent the summer following those marks. What they found horrified them. Shallow graves, sometimes entire families buried together in narrow ditches. Other times, scattered remains suggesting hurried disposal. In total, 17 burial sites were uncovered, some with remains so degraded it was impossible to determine who they were. This changed everything. It meant the Parker brothers hadn't just used the furnace. They had buried victims when it suited them, perhaps when the furnace was full or when they needed to avoid suspicion. The existence of graves also raised new fears. Were there others involved? Had more people helped dig, transport, or conceal these bodies? None of the townsfolk confessed. No new arrests were made. But whispers spread. And in small communities, whispers are poison. Neighbors began doubting one another. Friendly nods turned into cold glances. Long-standing friendships fell apart over unspoken accusations. Families changed churches, moved homes, stopped hosting dinners. Hayes had survived winter, but it was breaking under the thaw. Among those most affected were the children, especially those who had survived. While there, friends had vanished. Schools reopened in the fall, but desks sat empty. Teachers hesitated when calling roll. Some children asked difficult questions their parents couldn't answer. Why did Peter Brennan never come back? Why did Mrs. Kowalski's house smell like smoke? Why don't we play by the warehouse anymore? To help the youth cope, Reverend Hartwell started a small youth memorial program. The children painted stones for each lost family, writing names in bright colors, decorating them with symbols of peace, flowers, stars, doves. The stones were placed in a circle near the warehouse, now permanently boarded up. They called it the Garden of the Gone. Janet watered it every morning. Despite the darkness, small acts of beauty began to return. A wedding was held in the town square, the first since the tragedy. A baby was born in December and named Grace. Main Street, though quiet, reopened slowly with shops dusting off their shelves and restoring signs once darkened by soot and fear. Hayes would never be the same. Nor should it, because what happened, there was a reminder, not only of what evil could do, but what silence could allow. The Parker brothers thrived not only because they were cunning, but because no one questioned them when it mattered most. Janet wrote in her final 1901 journal entry, "It wasn't the fire that destroyed us. It was the trust. We trusted too easily, and we doubted too late." Hayes had learned that lesson with brutal clarity, and it was a lesson that would echo far beyond its borders. By the spring of 1902, the story of the Parker brothers had taken on a second life, one that extended far beyond the borders of Kansas. Academics, criminologists, and even early psychiatrists now viewed Hayes as a case study. How, they asked, could two men carry out such elaborate, sustained acts of evil under the noses of an entire town? The case was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a national question about human nature, trust, and the boundaries of morality. One of the first to take a clinical interest in the brothers was Dr. Hamilton Craig, an emerging figure in the field of criminal psychology at the University of Kansas. He had followed the case through newspaper accounts, but once the brothers were executed and court records unsealed, he traveled to Hayes himself to dig through every scrap of evidence. What he found there would form the foundation of his life's work. Dr. Craig interviewed dozens of Hayes residents, those who had known the Parkers, worked with them, or narrowly avoided becoming their victims. He studied their letters, examined the infamous ledgers, and even walked the same snowy paths the brothers had taken to and from their victims' homes. But it was Samuel Parker's diary that most fascinated him. Here was a window into a fractured, part rational, part delusional, and completely terrifying. In his analysis, Dr. Craig wrote, "The Parker brothers were not madmen in the classical sense. They were not chaotic, not compulsive. They were strategic, systematic, and disturbingly lucid. Their evil was not a storm, it was architecture." Dr. Craig proposed that the brothers exhibited traits now associated with psychopathy: lack of empathy, manipulative charm, and calculated cruelty. Yet they also demonstrated something even more unsettling: a shared delusion, a synchronized belief system that allowed them to rationalize every atrocity they committed. They believed they were not taking lives, Craig wrote. They believed they were removing obstacles, cleaning, purifying, optimizing. That belief system made their conscience irrelevant. In the diary, Samuel had repeatedly referred to their work as God's fire and compared the burning of victims to biblical floods, cleansing acts of divine necessity. They would have starved. They would have frozen. We offered mercy. But Craig noticed a chilling contradiction. For all their talk of mercy, the brothers didn't stop at those already dying. Over time, their selection criteria expanded, not based on need, but on value. Families with fertile land, tools in good condition, or a stockpile of food were marked as viable. Their elimination wasn't an act of kindness. It was strategic. Murder. Dr. Craig coined a new term for this kind of thinking: instrumental compassion, the use of empathy as a facade to achieve calculated, self-serving goals. Yet beyond the psychology of the killers, Craig turned his attention to the community. Why hadn't anyone stopped them sooner? How had they fooled not just neighbors, but an entire town? The answer Craig believed lay in what he called proximity blindness. We do not question the familiar, he argued. When evil wears a stranger's face, we are suspicious. But when it wears the face of a neighbor, we make excuses. The Parkers were part of the town's furniture. They attended church. They donated supplies. They offered services no one else dared to. And most importantly, they made themselves useful. In one entry, Thomas wrote, "People forgive anything if it looks like help." It worked every time. When they began asking questions about land titles, no one suspected their interest. When they visited the county records office multiple times a week, no one objected. And when families disappeared, their explanations, disease, starvation, relocation, were accepted without investigation. In Dr. Craig's published findings, he noted, the Parker brothers did not hide in darkness. They operated in daylight, shielded by the very trust their crimes would eventually destroy. Craig's research sent ripples through law enforcement circles. His findings were published in journals across the country and eventually compiled into a book titled The Furnace Mind, a study in systematic evil. In it, he outlined a new approach to criminal investigation, one that emphasized behavioral patterns over confessions, psychological red flags over circumstantial assumptions. He argued that what happened in Hayes wasn't unique. It was merely the first time it had been caught in such horrifying detail. Wherever desperation meets power, and no one is watching closely enough, there will always be men like the Parkers. But not everyone was eager to see Hayes remembered this way. Some residents resented the national attention. They felt their pain had been turned into spectacle, their loss reduced to academic theory. Others feared the long-term stain on the towns, named that their children and grandchildren would grow up in a place remembered only for ashes and lies. Still, there were those who saw value in the scrutiny. Mary Kellerman welcomed the researchers. She believed truth was its own kind of healing, and that by understanding the brothers' minds, others might be spared similar fates. "Let the world learn from our pain," she said, "so that no more towns fall asleep beside monsters." She continued her work with the state's historical committee, helping create archives from court documents, personal letters, and oral testimonies. She collaborated with Dr. Craig, providing him access to her handwritten timelines, maps, and cross-referenced property ledgers. Her records would later become part of the Kansas State Library's Hayes collection, now considered one of the most complete case studies of mass murder in American frontier history. Outside the academic world, artists and writers also took interest in the Parker case. Plays were written. A novel was serialized in Harper's Weekly. A traveling exhibit featured artifacts from the crime-recovered dolls, scorched furniture, and facsimiles of the infamous ledger pages. It was controversial, to say the least. Was it education or exploitation? The town debated fiercely. Reverend Hartwell opposed the exhibit, calling it a carnival of grief. But others argued that the story had to be told because forgetting was how it all started. Ultimately, the town agreed to one condition: any profit from public exhibitions must fund victim memorials and educational programs. Thus, the Parker Memorial Fund was born. With it, they established scholarships in the names of the lost, funded a town-wide census system to prevent future oversight, and even created a program to teach children how to recognize and report signs of abuse and exploitation. Out of the ash, something useful had grown. Dr. Craig returned to Hayes many times over the next decade, always visiting the iron obelisk before leaving. He often stood there for long minutes, hat in hand, eyes lowered. In one of his final visits, he spoke with Janet Thornfield, who was by then regarded as the town's quiet guardian. "You helped save this town," he told her, but she shook her head. "No," she said. "I just kept my eyes open when everyone else had theirs closed." By 1905, Hayes had taken on two identities. To the people who lived there, it was still a town of survivors, quietly rebuilding from unspeakable loss. To the outside world, it was a haunted place etched into the American imagination as then home of the furnace murders. Tourists occasionally came to see the infamous warehouse, now sealed behind iron bars and declared a historical site. They'd leave flowers at the memorials or peer through dusty windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of the past. But for the townspeople, the horrors were not museum pieces. They were memories that walked with them, and just when they thought the past had given up all its secrets, the land spoke again. God, it was a cool March morning when construction workers, hired to tear down an old barn on the outskirts of town, made a chilling discovery. Beneath a false wall in the foundation, they found a hidden chamber. The space was narrow, almost claustrophobic, lit only by the workers' lanterns. Dust clung to the air like fog, and inside, rows of wooden crates, labeled, organized, the workers. Called the sheriff immediately. Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, still in office, though grayer and slower, arrived within the hour. He stepped into the musty space with a sinking feeling. The Parkers, it seemed, had left behind yet another chapter. Inside the crates were more personal belongings. Children's toys, stitched blankets, watches, books, wedding bands. But these hadn't come from the main warehouse. These were different, older, stored with care. It was as if the brothers had intended to return for them, or never could bring themselves to burn them. The most important find, however, wasn't the artifacts dotted. Was a leather-bound ledger dot again, dot unlike the previous records. This one wasn't organized by date or name. It was written in a cipher, a mix of symbols, numbers, and shorthand scribbles that made no sense at first glance. But Hayes had changed since. 1,900. They had experience now. Tools, scholars. Within weeks, the code was broken. And what they found inside shook the town again. The new ledger contained entries dating back to 1895, a full 2 years earlier than anyone had previously believed the killings had begun. And while it lacked the same cold bookkeeping of the first ledger, it was far more disturbing in tone. These pages weren't just records. They were experiments the Parker brothers had, it seemed, been refining their methods long before the blizzards arrived. Early entries described how to test poisons, rat powders mixed into bread dough, arsenic added to tea. They tracked how quickly symptoms appeared, how long it took for death to occur, and whether or not the cause could be concealed. As illness, too quick raises suspicion, too slow risks survival. Children react faster. Adults disguise pain. One entry detailed how to stage a death from exposure, removing blankets and wetting clothing before dragging the body into the snow dot. Another described how to simulate signs of typhoid by mixing livestock waste into water barrels. They weren't just murderers. They were architects of believable death. Asterisk, the goal is not death, Thomas wrote. It is doubt. Doubt ensures no pursuit. Even more disturbing were entries that seemed to reveal a hierarchy among victims. Not everyone was killed for profit. Some were targeted for testing. Widow. No kin. Worthless estate. Ideal for suffocation trial. Young child, age 6. Testing tea blend. Record pain response. These weren't men driven by necessity or even cruelty. They were scientists of suffering. Among the names referenced in the early entries were families the town had never realized were victims. The Wexlers, the Adlers, the Corleys. Officially, they'd moved east. But now, doubts took root. Hayes reopened. Cold cases. Property records were reviewed. Former neighbors were questioned. One woman, now living in Missouri, recalled how the Wexler family left town in the middle of the night. But no one ever received a letter from them again. No visits. No news. And now their old home, long since sold, sat atop one of the newly discovered unmarked grave sites. Even worse, The new ledger hinted that the brothers may not have acted entirely alone. One coded passage mentioned delivery boys who know too much. Another referred to the man who buries for coin, possibly a hired grave digger. This revelation stirred the community again. Had there been more accomplices? People still living in Hayes? Names were whispered. Side glances exchanged. But no one was arrested. No one confessed. And after 5 years of trauma, the town wasn't sure it could endure another witch hunt. Instead, the second ledger was sealed in the town archives, accessible only to legal investigators and historians. Some argued it should be burned, but Mary Kellerman fought to preserve it. "We owe the truth to the ones we lost," she said, "even if it cuts us." The discovery also forced scholars like Dr. Hamilton Craig to revisit their earlier conclusions. He had previously believed the Parkers' descent into evil was triggered by environmental stress, the harsh winter, the isolation. But now he was forced to confront a darker reality. They weren't reacting to chaos, he wrote. They were building a system. The winter didn't create the Parker brothers. It gave them cover. Craig's updated work was published under a new title, Predators in Plain Sight. In it, he argued for the creation of behavioral monitoring systems in small towns, including regular background checks for those in estate services, coroner duties, and property transfer roles. Trust, he wrote, is earned through oversight, not assumption. His theories, once controversial, began to influence state law. Kansas, and eventually several other Western territories, adopted new protocols for handling unattended deaths requiring 2 verified witnesses, full autopsies, and property freezing until next of kin could be reached. These were known informally as the Parker Protocols, and they changed the frontier. But even as laws evolved and psychology advanced, the people of Hayes remained caught between past and future. The new ledger proved something they had long feared, but couldn't prove, that the Parkers had fooled them longer, more completely, and more intimately than anyone had realized. And yet, despite the deceit, the horror, and the guilt, Hayes did not vanish. It endured. New families moved in. Children played again near the Garden of the Gone. The town school expanded its history curriculum to include the Parker case, not as shame, but as instruction. Each spring, on the anniversary of the brothers' arrest, the town held a vigil not just for the dead, but for the watchers, as they were now called. People like Janet Thornfield, Dr. Hartwell, Mary Kellerman, those who had refused to look away, because in a world where monsters hide in good intentions, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is see. By 1908, nearly a decade had passed since the Parker brothers were hanged, but time had not healed Hayes in the way people hoped. The town functioned, children went to school, stores opened on schedule, marriages were celebrated, and crops harvested, but beneath the daily rhythm lingered a cold undercurrent. Like the chill that clings long after a fire's gone out, it was the silence that haunted them most. Not the screaming, not the mourning, but the absence of noise where once there had been laughter, conversation, music. Entire streets had gone. Quiet, homes were still boarded up. Some remained untouched since the day their occupants disappeared. The townspeople called them ghost houses. Some avoided them completely. Others claimed to hear strange sounds at night, footsteps, crying, distant voices that faded when approached. These weren't ghost stories told for thrills. They were collective echoes of trauma that refused to settle. The Parker warehouse remained sealed, iron-barred, and untouched. But despite the barrier, people still walked past it warily, like the building itself was listening. Over time, no birds nested on its roof. No vines crawled up its walls. It stood frozen, as if time had held it back out of fear. And then, in the final weeks of 1908, something changed. A letter arrived at the Hayes town office from a man named Elias Marin, a former coroner from Colorado. He claimed he had once met Thomas Parker in 1894 while traveling through Kansas to conduct a land survey. According to Marin, Parker had expressed interest in innovative mortuary techniques and asked oddly specific questions about cremation temperatures, human decomposition rates, and how to mask chemical residue in corpses. The timing aligned perfectly with the Parker's arrival in Hayes. What disturbed officials most, however, was Marin's final line. I believed him to be studying for medical school. Now I fear he was preparing for something else entirely. The letter reignited curiosity across the region. Scholars, journalists, and state officials reappeared in Hayes, asking if any more evidence had been uncovered. The town had long since sealed away most of the case material, placing it in the basement archives of the county courthouse, accessible only by court order. But with renewed interest came a renewed purpose, led by Reverend Hartwell and Mary Kellerman. The town voted to organize a public symposium. They titled it Hayes and the Ethics of Memory. Held in the town hall that November, the symposium brought together voices from all over the Midwest, academics, theologians, physicians, and even descendants of Parker victims. It was part history lesson, part reckoning. Dr. Hamilton Craig, older and thinner now, delivered the keynote speech. He spoke not only about the Parker brothers' crimes, but about the deeper threat they represented, the idea that kindness can be weaponized, that helpfulness can hide hunger. We teach our children to trust those who offer aid, he said, but we must also teach them to ask, why? Why are you helping me? What do you gain? Kindness is not a mask, but it can be worn like one. The speech was met with uneasy silence, then long applause. But it was Mary Kellerman who delivered the words no one forgot. If we bury the truth, we bury the dead a second time. She proposed that the town reopen the Parker files permanently and make them publicly accessible, not only for transparency, but as a form of civic education. Her idea was met with mixed emotions. Some were eager to preserve history. Others, especially younger residents, felt it was time to move on, but the town voted in favor. The Parker archives were officially opened the following spring, relocated from the courthouse to a newly built remembrance hall, a modest museum, and research center on the edge of town. Inside, visitors found copies of the ledgers, personal belongings of victims, photographs, and interactive exhibits that walked them through how the brothers manipulated systems to gain control. Most haunting of all was a single wall, painted matte black, inscribed with hundreds of names, some confirmed, some suspected, under the heading, "They were here." The opening of Remembrance Hall had an unexpected effect. Young people began engaging with the town's history, not just as trauma, but as a call to vigilance. Local schools held tours. Art students painted portraits of the lost. Essays, poems, and memorial projects flooded in. One student, a 13-year-old named Eliza Merrill, wrote, "They were erased so completely that we almost lost the meaning of their lives, but now we remember them. Now we write them." She placed her drawing an image of a mother holding a child beneath a snow-covered sky on the wall beside the name Kowalski. The town also launched a controversial project, the Listening House, located on the site of one of the old ghost homes. It was designed not to be restored, but left exactly as it had been found, half-furnished, cold, and quiet. Visitors could walk its creaking floorboards, examine the soot on the hearth, and sit in silence. Nothing played inside. No docent spoke. Only the wind through broken shutters and the ache of stillness. It became one of the most visited sites in Kansas. Within a year, some wept inside it, some left letters behind, some simply stood in the quiet and let the weight of the absence press against their hearts. But with all remembrance comes risk. The deeper the town dug into the Parker brothers' legacy, the more theories emerged. A historian from St. Louis claimed the brothers may have belonged to an obscure philosophical society, obsessed with purification rituals, one that advocated for selective survival of the morally upright. Another visitor suggested the brothers were inspired by Old Testament plagues, citing diary lines like, "The fire cleanses what the blood cannot." Even more chillingly, some began to wonder if others like the Parkers had existed elsewhere, people who masked cruelty behind usefulness, hidden in other towns, other winters. They weren't extraordinary, one scholar said. They were ordinary men with no leash. That idea haunted Hayes more than anything, because if the Parkers weren't unique, if their evil was simply a dormant possibility in anyone, then remembering them wasn't enough. You had to learn from them. You had to guard against them. Always. One winter evening, Janet Thornfield, now nearly 80, stood alone outside the warehouse. She had refused to leave Hayes, even as friends died or moved away. She refused to let memory become myth. With her cane planted firmly in the frost, she stared at the building's scorched frame. A light snow began to fall. A reporter visiting from Chicago approached her and asked, "Why do you still come here?" She didn't look away. Her voice was soft. "Because it started here in silence, and silence can always start again." It had been 15 years since the snow first sealed Hayes from the rest of the world. 15 years since the Parker brothers turned a Kansas town into a furnace-fed machine of silence and disappearance. And though the winters came and went, bringing new storms and fresh crops, the echoes of what happened in 1899 never fully melted. Yet, remarkably, Hayes endured. By 1915, the town had become a paradox, a place both burdened and blessed by its own history. What began as a massacre became a movement. What once brought shame now seeded vigilance, education, and slowly renewal. And so, when Hayes held its first annual day of reflection, it wasn't just for the townsfolk. Visitors arrived by train and wagon from across the state, some out of curiosity, others out of shared pain. Survivors' descendants, students, and scholars gathered under the same sky that once wept snow over shallow graves. The town square, once a site of fear and whispers, now held candles on every corner, placed with reverence around the black iron obelisk. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Memory is not mourning, it is warning." That first reflection day began with the tolling of a bell, one ring for each of the 312 confirmed victims. The sound carried across the rooftops, into barns, through schoolrooms, and across fields that had once hidden crimes. But it wasn't the only ceremony that day. Inside Remembrance Hall, a new exhibit opened. It was titled "The Fire We Carry." Unlike past exhibits, which focused on the crimes, the ledgers, and the psychological profiles of Thomas and Samuel Parker, this one looked forward. It showcased how other towns had taken Hayes's example and implemented new safeguards: community oversight councils, mandatory reviews of estate transfers, psychological screenings for officials in coroner or probate roles. On the walls were framed letters from other communities, thanking Hayes for its painful lessons. In one, the mayor of a town in Montana wrote, "Because of Hayes, we asked questions before accepting comfort, and it saved lives." Another, from a teacher in Idaho, "I teach my students about Hayes not as horror, but as history. We don't fear the dark, we check it for light." Hayes had become a kind of moral lighthouse, not a shining city on a hill, but a warning post in the valley. Still, not everything could be rebuilt. Some houses remained untouched, frozen in time, reminders of those who never returned. Others were leveled, their land turned into public gardens and parks. In place of one such home stood Grace Hollow, a library and community center named after the first child born in Hayes after the winter of 1900. Inside hung a mural, faceless silhouettes walking out of shadows into morning light. In the center of the mural, a single match was lit its flame, illuminating their path. Janet Thornfield did not live to see the mural. She passed in her sleep in 1913 at the age of 87. Her journals, preserved by Mary Kellerman, became part of the Hayes archive and are still quoted by scholars today. In her final entry, she had written, "We thought the fire was behind us, but it lives in memory, in vigilance, in every child taught to ask questions. We do not escape it. We carry it so no one else has to burn." Her funeral was held in the town square. Hundreds attended. Even those who had moved away returned. She was buried not beside family, but among victims, those whose names she had protected, those whose voices she had helped restore. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, her closest ally and the last living member of the original investigation group, gave her eulogy. "She never stopped watching," he said, "even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt." He died 2 years later, and his final medical journal entry was just 5 words long. "Some wounds must stay open." Hayes changed again in the decades that followed. Technology came, the railway expanded, the children of survivors had children of their own. Time, as it always does, moved forward, but the memory remained. Each winter, just before the first snowfall, the town held a quiet march. They'd walk from the church to the garden of the gone, lanterns in hand, pausing at each ghost house to lay a white flower at the step. At the end of the route, a youngest child present would read from a list of names, not the names of the dead, but the names of those who looked away. Because in every story of evil, one mayor explained, there are villains and there are the silent. The townsfolk didn't read those names to shame the families. They read them to remind themselves. By the time Hayes entered the modern age, it had become part of textbooks and university syllabi. The Parker brothers were no longer just murderers. They were historical case studies, cautionary tales, symbols of what happens when no one listens and no one asks. But in Hayes, their legacy was not horror. It was accountability. The warehouse still stands. The furnace, long cold, remains sealed beneath layers of brick and steel. Children are warned never to play near it, not because of ghosts, but because of what it taught their ancestors. And above the warehouse door, etched in fading iron, are words added by the townspeople in 1920. "Truth does not die in fire." In the end, the story of Hayes is not just about murder. It's about memory, about what we choose to see, what we choose to ignore, and how the dead are never truly gone until we forget their names. Hayes remembered, and in remembering, it rose, as a town without scars, but as a place that bore them with purpose.